All right, welcome back everybody. So we're almost done with Adventure Park Trigger, and so today let's go ahead and review where we're at. We've pretty much knocked out everything in the handler itself. So this is all conforming to our design. And if you remember, our design is structured around this idea of the trigger, the handler, and the helper. The trigger just determines trigger context. The handler has conditions and it collects data, and then it passes that data off to the handler for processing. So we had to go through a little bit of work to get it there, and we still have a little bit more work to go. So we notice now there's still one additional class that's doing something, which is the service appointment handler. So we're going to come back to that in a little bit. So before we get there, though, let's go ahead and look at our handler. We can see that our on before insert looks good. We have a data structure to collect a certain kind of adventure parks, parks that need price books. So when there's not a price book, we add it, and then we check to see if it's empty before passing it off to the helper. We can look at our after insert, and this happens unconditionally, but we at least set up the structure to where we could add conditional logic. We could add a for loop here if we needed to, but we can see that all new parks will have the crate related data happen to them. So it's very clear what's happening now. On before update, we also have a clean structure where we have we're setting the value because in this case, we don't need to pass it off for handling because this all can happen at the same time. We may want to move this into a flow at some point. Some of the before update and before insert logic is suitable for that. In this case, it's very simple logic, right? We're just preventing someone from deleting a price book. So if the new price book doesn't have a value, but the old one does, then we're gonna reset it. And then we have these two pieces of logic that are in a to-do state. These are going to be moved into a scheduled batch job because it makes more sense to do that. If you remember, because this logic would only be triggered when the record is updated, it doesn't really make sense. It really should be a scheduled because every day it's possible that a park is open or closed. So we really want to check every day to see if it's opened or closed. And the best way to do that is through a scheduled job. And then finally, we have our on after update. So again, we have a good structure. We have our deactivated parks by ID. We have our conditional logic. We're populating the data structure and then passing it off for handling. So lastly, let's go ahead and look at our helper. And we have these methods that are not too big. That's a good indication that it's a pretty good method, and it's named well, set price books. I can imagine that what we're going to do here is we're going to set the price book. We're going to create price books from parks. What do we probably do with that? Well, we're probably going to create a price book. So that's pretty good. When we're creating related data, well, what data are we creating? If we want to know, we can by stepping into the method, and we can see that we create accounts, create products, create price book entries, and create assets. Very clear, very clean. And then all the details of how these things happen in these individual helpers. So we have the create accounts, create products, create price book entries, and create assets. And each one of those is fairly small, fairly easy to read through and reason about. And lastly, we have this deactivate related POI that we know from our after update. And so here we're deactivating related data, and it's very clean as well. So this is like so simple. Like this code is so simple because it's been simplified. Just like when you write an email to someone, you can write it and it can be hundreds of words long. But if you revise it and refine it a little bit, you can get it down to a couple sentences. And the person reading the email is more likely to understand what it is you're trying to communicate because you're very clear on what you're communicating. So the clearer we can be in communicating what our code is doing, the better, the more readable, maintainable, and usually more understandable the code will be. So let's go ahead and look at our test because right now we haven't paid a lot of attention. When we first started this, we began by kind of refactoring our test just to kind of get an idea of what we had and what we didn't have. But now what we're going to do is we're going to improve this. So we're going to go ahead and run this with coverage. And we're going to see what our overall code coverage is for our Adventure Park trigger, handler, and helper. And then anything we need to cover the gaps, we're going to write some test coverage for it. While that runs, we can see, okay, here we go. So we have only 70% code coverage for our trigger, 30%, 37% for our handler, and 88% for our helper. So it's not too good, right? We need a lot of work to make this a lot better. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we have. We first have this should create supporting record when park is created. So we create a park, we check that there's a price book for it. There's an account, product, price book entry, and asset. And that completely corresponds to what we know from the code. So one thing I like to do is I like to add something that I like to call a test ref or a test reference. So inside this helper class, I'm going to find the related public methods. And I can see that this is going to touch this, set price book, and created data. So what this does for me now is that for me in the future and for other developers, when they come across this code and they want to know what the correlation is between the different tests, they don't have to guess. They can just see, okay, this method is covered by this particular test. And so if they extend it or they add a new functionality or maybe do a bug fix, they'll know exactly which thing to go to. So again, you're saving yourself time and you're adding a little bit more context and understanding to the code. It's very easy to do. And if you have Java docs, you can add this in too. So that's kind of the main things we're covering there. And that gives us a lot, right? Right now, even though our code coverage is low for the trigger and the handler and the helper, we're not too bad. We're enough to deploy over 75% at 88. So we're checking all of these methods here. So what's next is that we need to deal with our deactivate related price book entry. And we need to deal with our on before update context, and then after update will be what we talked about. So let's start with our on before update. And we can see that now this is our situation where we try to remove a price book. So this is fairly straightforward in terms of a test. And what we'll do is we'll create a new one. So is test static void should prevent deletion of price book on park. All right. And we know that when we insert a park, we're going to have the price book created. So what we can do is we can insert that as part of our setup. And then if we fetch this from the database, we would expect to find a price book. Oh, equals might be nice. And then we can just do a sanity check. I like to do sanity check, so I will put assertions in from time to time. So I'm just going to check that this is not null, that the park's price book is not null. And then in our test block, I'm going to take the park, I'm going to take the price book, I'm going to set it to null, and then I'm going to update the park. And then we're going to do the exact same thing where we're going to fetch it again, and we're going to check that it's not null. Save that and deploy it. Run our test. All good. Now let's go ahead and run coverage on just this one. And what we'll expect to see is that this handler will be fully covered, and it is fully covered. So we're looking good. We've just improved the code coverage by a little bit, and we have a better test. So now what we're going to do is we're going to set this. And because this happens in inside the before update context, I'll just add the test here in the handler instead of in the helper, since there's not a helper. All right. And then let's go ahead and do a commit. All right. So we are going to do in this test. So we're going to add test to ensure price book cannot be deleted. And then we're going to add test refs. Push that. Okay, so that's looking good. And now we're going to go on to our on after update context. And here this park is being deactivated. So the open date is less than today. It is active. These don't equal. So the new and the old value, this is being updated. And it's not active. So the Boolean is false. And there's not and there is an activated date. Okay, so what we're going to do again is we will create a new test. Now, before we do that, if we look back at this old test we have, this one is doing a few things for us already. We're creating a park, we're creating a lead, we're creating a park of interest. And that's kind of what we're concerned with here, is that we want to set this as inactive when the adventure park becomes inactive. So let's go ahead and review what we have here. We have this to do to move the test logic into, okay, so this we can kind of ignore that because we'll rewrite this in a later date. We need this, this is making sense now because the park has an open date of today, but we want it to be less than today. So we need to add a day. And I think we want it to be -1. We will, what are you? Okay, so some of this stuff was related to the batch and we're not doing it here directly now. So we'll just manually manipulate the data as if the batch had updated it so that it meets the entrance criteria for our method. So we don't need this now park. And we don't need to check for an inactivated date because we're going to set that ourselves. And we don't need to update it twice. So is active is false. We're updating that now. The open date is going to be less than today. This is going to be inside our test.start, test.stop. And then let's just double check. So our open date is less than, our inactivate is changing, and then we do need an inactivated date. So we're going to go ahead and set that for today. So let's do that. Park.inactivated date equals date.today. And this is a date field, yes, so it works. So now we're going to we can query this park. So we are checking. Well, we don't really need to actually. So what we can do is we can use the existing parks inactivated date. So we're going to fetch the new POI, the park of interest, using actually what we want to do is we want to get a list of these. Oh wait, no, it's going to be that one. Yeah, we're good. So we're inserting this POI. We're going to fetch it here and we're going to check that it's inactive and that the date's equal. That makes sense to me. And then we're going to rename this test because this is not a good name. Test updating a park doesn't really tell us anything. So this should deactivate related POI when part is deactivated. Okay, let's run this. Fingers crossed. Failed. Let's see. Assertion failed. POI inactive is false. Okay, so let's see what's going on here. Let's go ahead and run this with coverage, and we'll see how far we're getting, because we're probably missing something. Maybe we had something backwards, or there's something that's not going right, and we're not reaching the code that we're supposed to reach. So that's what's going on here, is that, let's see, the date looks like it was good. The park looks like it's good. Looks like this is not what's happening. It looks like the old and the new are the same, which means that when we created the park before, it wasn't active. So let's go ahead and set it to be active, and this should fix it. Did not. Okay. So the problem here is in something else, right? Some other code that we haven't looked at, in this case, the service appointment trigger handler, is that when it's active and it's an insert, there needs to be a date, open date. So we just learned a little bit more about our code, and that's fine. We can just kind of add an open date equals date dot today. And we're going to set this to, we're going to add days, and we'll set it to 5 days ago. And this is really common. You know, everyone who's kind of done tests, it can be very frustrating because you bump up against things you don't expect to. But these are all valid insights, because the reality is that our code is going to run in this environment. We want to know these problems. We want to have a better insight into how it works. And even when it is just our test data, we may come to understand more about our code base by kind of bumping into these things. So our test pass, that's good. And so let's go ahead and run this with coverage, and we'll just double check this is working as we wanted it to. We should see on our after update, all this should be covered. And it is covered, and the deactivated POI is covered. So now we're going to add our test ref, and we're going to add it to the helper this time. So again, when I do these, I don't add them for the private, because the private they're usually related to a public one, just to kind of keep the code clean and the separation of concerns clear about what's doing what. So I usually will add a test reference to public methods. So we will see. Oops, there we go. All right, so we're gonna add, so update test to check for POI deactivation. And then add a test reference. Push that. Alrighty, now let's go ahead, and before we wrap up for today, we're going to rerun all of our tests and see what our code coverage is. And hopefully we are in a good shape. While that's running, I kind of like to put setup and test creation data at the bottom. I don't like seeing it as the first thing I see whenever I go into a test, because it's like I need to scroll past it, and I may or may not care about it anyway. I think it stays out of the way when it's at the bottom, so it's up to you. But we're 100% across the board. That's looking great. So I think that we're good now. So what we're going to do next is, before we wrap up Adventure Trigger, we have 2 more big things to do. The next thing is we have to deal with this service appointment handler, figure out what it's doing and what we want it to do and where it should fit, because it's breaking our design on some level. It's breaking our design. You may be able to make a case that you want a bunch of different classes being called from your trigger, but I think that makes our code more difficult to reason about. And we're going to move to a better trigger framework in the future. This is the most primitive one. The trigger handler helper is the most basic structure and design that your code can have. It's a great place to start for a lot of code bases, but once you get into more an enterprise scale, you're going to want to use a more advanced trigger framework, and there's a bunch of them out there. And we'll get there once we've kind of refactored this code base. We're going to look at the trigger actions framework specifically. But for now, we're good for today. And we're going to come back for the service appointment handler, and we're also going to come back to deal with our scheduled batch job. All right, so thanks so much. I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you on the next episode. Bye.